So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to him. We'll have a little bit more of a gracious time period for him to present and for you guys to ask questions, though we'll still try to keep closer to erring on the side of the virtuous mean of time that our hosts have suggested. So with that, if you want to take it away, Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today. As you already know, I'm Leonard Kahn. My permanent home is Loyola University, New Orleans, but this year I'm also serving as the Donald and Beverly Freeman Fellow at the U.S. Naval Academy, and for that reason, I owe you a disclaimer. Let me say that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Naval Academy, or the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, where I'm currently housed. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. I thought it'd be a good idea for me to give you a high-level overview of the project on which I'm working. I think it'll provide some context for some things I'll say here. So here it is in a nutshell. Just war theory purports to tell us when, if ever, war is justified. However, in its present form, just war theory ignores what I'll call environmentally mediated military harm. More on that in a few minutes. This form of harm is often very serious, and once this form of harm is taken into consideration, war is harder to justify. All of that might seem fairly humdrum, but this is a case of the devil being in the details, as he so often is. So here's what I'll discuss today. First, I'll talk about just war theory and especially ad bellum proportionality. This will be familiar to some of you, but not all of you. So I want to make sure we're all essentially on the same page. Then I'll talk about the nature of environmentally mediated military harm. And this is a somewhat novel concept that I'll introduce. And finally, I'll consider some challenges for incorporating environmentally mediated military harm into just war theory. The material will run about 25-ish minutes, so there should be plenty of time for discussion, even more so since Mark won't be here. So just war theory attempts to steer a middle course between two very different claims. One of these is usually called realism. According to realism, war is not the sort of thing to which moral properties apply at all. According to realists, people who talk about wars as being just or unjust, right, are making a kind of category mistake, more or less on a par with talking about rocks and trees as being morally justified. Just not the kind of things that can bear those properties. Examples of realists include people like Hans Morgenthau, Henry Kissinger, and George Kennan. Second claim here that just war theory tries to steer a course between is pacifism. Pacifists disagree with realists in as much as they claim that, in fact, war is the sort of thing that can bear moral properties, but it's also the case that war is never morally justified. It's not the case then that there's any war such that that war has the property of being justified. Examples include Robert Holmes and Richard Norman, to take some recent philosophers. Just war theory denies both of these claims while specifying conditions under which war is morally justified. And this is a tradition that goes back at least as far as Augustine and Aquinas, and counts such diverse thinkers as Michael Walzer, Jeff McMahon, Cecile Fabre, and Helen Froh among its contemporary representatives. So what I'm going to do now, since just war theory is quite a broad topic, I'm going to narrow down the focus for this paper. I'll do that over the next two slides. So just war theory is traditionally divided into three parts. Jus ad bellum, this concerns the conditions under which one can begin and continue war. Jus in bello, this concerns the conditions under which one can use military force during war. And jus post bellum, this concerns the conditions under which war can be concluded and war's aftermath can be managed. So I'll only be concerned with use ad bellum in this presentation, but if people want to talk about broader applications during the Q&A, that's fine. So let's talk about use ad bellum. In order for a country, sorry for the double preposition there, to fight a war justly, some version of the following necessary conditions must be met. And I say some version because just war theorists will disagree with one another over exactly how these conditions are specified, but that needn't worry us here. Okay. The war must have a just cause, and I'll point this out a few times. The just cause is usually self or other defense against aggression. The war must be proportional. The war must be likely to succeed. A state of war must be publicly declared by a legitimate authority, and the war must be a last resort. My concern here in this presentation is almost entirely with proportionality, okay? To which condition I'll return in a second. Every once in a while, I'll say some things about just cause, but it's really proportionality that I want to talk about here. As a first pass, the ad bellum proportionality condition states that a war's costs cannot exceed its benefits. There are a few things to note, however. First, let me stress that this is meant to be a necessary, not a sufficient condition for justifying war. Second, the costs and benefits, as we'll see in a moment, should not be thought of in terms of, say, dollars and cents. Though, of course, one could try to quantify them in those terms if one really wanted. However, that's certainly not my aim here. An example of a war that was unjustified because it violated the proportionality condition would be, let's say, World War II. Right? Though, of course, it almost certainly violated other use ad bellum conditions as well. World War I caused the death of between 15 and 22 million humans, radically dwarfing whatever might have counted as its benefits with respect to Austro-Hungarian succession. Of course, some very costly wars are good candidates for being proportional. And the American Civil War, which cost about 700,000 lives, was plausibly proportionate given the cause of ending slavery in the United States. Now, there's a lot to say about proportionality, much more than I can even allude to here. But I want to emphasize the fact that the costs and benefits of proportionality are asymmetrical. There's a longish quote from Tom Herka on this topic on your screen, but I'm just going to paraphrase his idea and give you an example or two. When weighing the costs and benefits of war, the benefits are understood narrowly while the costs are understood broadly. And the narrow benefits are the attainment of a war's justified ends. Again, usually self or other defense against aggression, as we saw just a moment ago. The broad costs include all of the terrible harms that can come with war. For example, the fact that a war would boost technological development and increase economic growth over 10 years is not counted as a benefit for determining proportionality. But the fact that a war would devastate the economy of the country in which the war is fought does count as a cost with respect to proportionality. So there's an asymmetry there. Again, the fact that some people might very much enjoy a war, perhaps because it provides them with an opportunity to test their manhood, does not count as a benefit of war. But the fact that a war would make people miserable does count as a cost. What justifies this asymmetry is a really interesting question, but it's not one I'll try to answer here. Since this assumption about asymmetry is almost universal in just war theory, I'm just going to help myself to it. But if just war theory giveth, it also taketh away. And just war theory has traditionally been unconcerned with harms done to non-human animals, to plants, and to ecosystems as a whole, except inasmuch as these harms have effects on human animals. In order to fully engage with just war theory, I'm going to take on that assumption here too. But again, we can talk in the Q&A about loosening this assumption if you like. All right, so much for just war theory. Let's talk about something I'm going to call environmentally mediated military harm. So let's say a harm X is an environmentally mediated military harm, or EMM harm, since that's a mouthful, if and only if it meets the following two conditions. Okay. First condition, it occurs because of a military action undertaken during war. Second, it occurs through damage done to the environment. damage done through the environment is the medium through which the harm happens to humans. Let me stress, this is a working definition, and it has some flaws that need to be addressed. I'll even point to some of those flaws a little later in the presentation. But let me talk you through some aspects of it. First, I'm using terms like harm, military, and war in a non-technical sense. As such, they're somewhat vague and will give rise to borderline cases that I'll ignore here since there are plenty of clear examples with which to work. However, I'm using the term environment as a shorthand for natural environment. And by that, I mean something like the physical, chemical, and biological elements upon which ecological communities and their community members depend for their continued existence. So not exactly in the non-technical sense, that term needs to be tidied up a bit in order for this to make good sense. It's useful to think of EMM harms as involving 3 stages. So the first stage is a military action which damages the environment. Second is the actual damage done to the environment by the action. And the third is the harm done to humans as a result of the damage done to the environment. So that's going to be the kind of framework in which I'll talk about EMM harms. And what I'll do in the next couple of slides is go through some concrete examples of these, some imaginary, some that come from recent history. So here's the first example. Okay. Suppose in stage 1 that combatants move through a forest or agricultural area using heavy vehicles as they do. Stage 2 consists of the actual damage done to the habitat of animals used for food or to crops and the fields in which the crops are grown. Stage 3 is the harm, including malnutrition and even starvation, caused by the lack of food. EMM harm of this sort can be unintentional, though in those cases, it can also be culpably reckless as well. That probably characterizes many EMM harms, but not all harms of this kind are unintentional. So consider a second example. Okay. Stage 1, a bombing campaign is undertaken in forest and agricultural areas to deny enemy combatants food and shelter. Stage 2, the bombing causes not only the destruction of forests and crops, but so much damage to the agricultural land that crops cannot be grown again without significant repair, something that might be impossible while the war continues and therefore might be impossible for years. Moreover, even plants that survive the initial bombardment often succumb to fungal infections and the like that begin with the damage caused by the explosives. The effect of the environmental damage on humans, especially non-combatants in this case, right, is malnutrition and starvation. By the way, this example is not hypothetical and actually happened during the aerial bombardment of rice paddies during the Vietnam War. Many of the bomb craters left the rice paddies too deep to grow rice afterwards. In fact, it's been estimated that about 14 million tons of bombs were used by the United States in the Vietnam War, an order of magnitude more than were dropped on Germany during World War II. Furthermore, it's also worth noting that the use of napalm, also and famously a part of American military activities in the war, can render soil useless for growing food for years or even decades thereafter. And by the way, a lot of the examples that I'll use here are from the Vietnam War, in part because it's a fairly well-studied war in terms of its environmental effects, and in part simply because I have a somewhat limited knowledge of the many wars and their effects on the environment, and I'm drawing on what I know, right, rather than what I don't, which seems to make a kind of sense. All right. So another example of an EMM harm occurs when, in stage 1, military activities destroy a waste treatment plant, which, stage 2, allows water sources to become contaminated, right, leading, stage 3, to outbreaks of acute waterborne diseases such as, and again, these are real world examples, typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery, among others. There are, it should be noted, many other ways in which water supplies can be made dangerous and unusable by military operations. To take another example, more or less at random, military damage to mining operations can allow toxic substances to enter groundwater, making well water non-potable. So most of the EMM harms I just discussed occur in the short term. However, other instances of EMM harm play out over the long term. While I've already noted that interruptions to the food supply can cause intense suffering and even death in the short term, they can also cause stunting to children who manage to survive. According to the World Health Organization, stunting is the impaired growth and development that children experience as a result of poor nutrition, right, especially in the first 3 years of life. Children are defined as stunted if their height for age is more than 2 standard deviations below the WHO Child Growth Standards median. There's ample evidence that stunting leads to much worse health and economic outcomes over one's entire life. Hence, a child being deprived of adequate nutrition, again, especially in the first 3 years of life, as a result of damage done to her environment, can cause nearly a century's worth of harm. Here's another example of a long-term EMM harm. The toxic remnants of war can affect people from before their births to the time of their deaths. As an illustration, consider the use of the defoliants agents blue, orange, and white by Britain in Malaysia and the United States in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. These defoliants, especially Agent Orange, were introduced to reduce food supplies and to clear areas where enemy combatants could conceal themselves, and they were fairly effective at doing both. The reduction in food supplies caused a great deal of suffering, however, among non-combatants during the Vietnam War. However, use of these herbicides also had and continues to have long-lasting health effects. It's well established that continued exposure to Agent Orange causes chronic diseases, including those affecting the endocrine, nervous, circulatory, respiratory, and digestive systems. In 2012, the Red Cross estimated that about 1 million people living in Vietnam have disabilities or health problems related to the use of Agent Orange, almost 40 years after the war ended. Another way in which EMM harm can manifest in the long term is when the environment is polluted with radioactive substances. Such substances can increase the likelihood over decades of developing various kinds of cancer. For example, there's reason to think that military use of US military use of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War has led to this outcome in northern Kuwait and southern Iraq, though this hypothesis remains controversial. Far less controversial and far more dramatic are the oncological effects of the irradiation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the use of atomic bombs at the end of World War II. In general, many aspects of the long-term human costs of the environment contaminated by the use of nuclear weapons has been well understood for decades. At the extreme end of the spectrum, widespread use of nuclear weapons threatens nuclear winter. Though its precise effects are hard to judge and, again, controversial, the damage done to the environment and consequent harms to humans would likely be immense. Moreover, some instances of long-term EMM harm take forms that don't involve direct assaults on human health. One example is damage to ecosystems that forces its inhabitants to become displaced persons for years. The example of the Vietnam War is relevant once again, since the intense bombing campaigns made it impossible for many people living in rural areas to remain on land that their families had worked for generations. Almost all of these people were forced for years into unfamiliar and often quite unwelcoming urban areas. In fact, conflicts like these can force people into refugee status for decades or more. Yet another example of long-term EMM harm concerns global climate change. And I'd hoped, I have to admit, to say a lot more about this in the paper, but we can come back to this in the Q&A. It turns out this is a topic well worth discussion, but I think it works a bit better once some of these more obvious harms have been taken into consideration. Militaries are major producers of greenhouse gases, and wars have caused large increases in global greenhouse gas emissions since at least the middle of the last century. In addition, damage done to military and non-military targets can also accelerate global climate change. One obvious example is damage done to oil refineries, which can cause long-lasting oil fires. There are, of course, too many ways in which global climate change can make human lives shorter and worse to list here. Before continuing, let me be clear that this working definition of EMM harm has its drawbacks. First, it includes harm caused by, for example, naturally occurring shrapnel, right? So a bomb that blows a tree to smithereens right, can cause those smithereens to lacerate and shred human beings. That's technically meets the definition I've got here, but intuitively that's not what I at least had in mind with environmentally mediated military harm. Second, it excludes harm caused by, for example, agricultural lands that have been made unusable by landmines or unexploded ordnance, since it's avoiding these things that causes the harm, not the damage done to the environment itself. Third, it ignores harm done by militaries during peacetime, which is, by the way, something I've intentionally avoided as part of the definition because I'm concerned about use ad bellum here rather than, as it were, use pre-bellum. But I don't want to ignore these harms entirely since they can be significant. So I freely admit more labor is needed here, even if the working definition gets a lot right, as I think it does. While examples of EMM harm are plentiful, examples of just war theorists taking them seriously are not. It's true that some just war theorists have occasionally gestured in the direction of certain short-term EMM harms. For instance, Michael Walzer mentions in passing the Deuteronomic ban on cutting down one's enemy's fruit trees because of the consequences on the food supply for non-combatants, though he does so within the context of in bello rather than ad bellum proportionality. Merritt Drucker also discusses environmental damage as it concerns in bello proportionality, work by Greg Reichenberg and Henrik Seiza, as well as by Marcus Hedal, Scott Clark, and Michael Beggins address environmental damage and ad bellum proportionality, though not in detail. And of course, and it's really unfortunate that Mark Woods couldn't be here today because he's done really important work on this topic too, and is in the midst of more of it. But despite this general neglect, no systematic case for excluding EMM harm from the ad bellum proportionality condition has, to the best of my knowledge, been made. So what I'll do by way of concluding this presentation is to consider some reasons for this, and then in the most hand-wavy manner possible, suggest lines of response. So one reason for neglecting EMM harm might be that EMM harm itself is still poorly understood. Even though instances of EMM harm are obvious once our attention is brought to them, the empirical study of the phenomenon is dangerous, difficult, and costly. In some cases, it's essentially impossible. Consider the fact that southern Iraq remained in the hands of Saddam's regime after the end of the first Gulf War. As such, it was largely off limits, to environmental scientists in the 1990s. Therefore, our understanding of the EMM harms associated with this war is impoverished. It's typical for wars to have messy and ambiguous endings like these, and being unable to study their aftermath is probably the norm rather than the exception. Moreover, study of environmental damage after the fact is less useful if we do not have a baseline with which to compare it. Again, the Vietnam War provides an illustrative example. The environmental conditions of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were not as well studied as one might have hoped prior to the wars there. Hence, our understanding of how much worse the damage made the situation is somewhat speculative. As a result, estimates of the size and scope of instances of EMM harm vary considerably, and uncertainty about them is relatively high. Yet if these factors explain why EMM harm is ignored, they don't really justify doing so. The harm is real enough, and discussing it within the context of just war theory can only encourage further rigorous empirical study. Though it goes beyond the scope of this presentation, I think an excellent case can be made for putting the study of EMM harm at the top of the agenda of institutions like the United Nations Environmental Program, as well as other similar international bodies. What's needed is thorough and meticulous study of EMM harm by well-regarded bodies who are not parties to the conflicts in question. Another possible explanation for the lack of interest in EMM harm among just war theorists is a cautious attitude concerning the ad bellum proportionality condition and what the condition can, in general, tell us. For example, Walzer remarks that proportionality is merely a gross truth that does not allow for fine distinctions. Well, it's not hard to have sympathy for Walzer's epistemic modesty. It seems misapplied here. Caution about relying on the proportionality condition is most appropriate when it's difficult to measure both the benefits and the costs of the phenomenon associated with war. However, damage to the environment has few, if any, benefits and many costs. Even if we're not able to speak with much precision about these costs, it would be unwise to ignore them for this reason, since ignoring the evidence puts a thumb down on the side of the permissibility of war. Doing so is at least as bad as putting a thumb down on the side of the impermissibility of war, and possibly much worse. A related worry is that the benefits and harms that are meant to fall within the scope of proportionality are either incommensurable or incomparable. The idea is, crudely speaking, that the justified goals of war, that is to say, defense of national sovereignty against the aggression of another state, cannot be usefully weighed against the harms to the environment. There is, on this way of thinking, simply no common currency with which to make these comparisons, even if we had all of the information. I've just suggested that international bodies should be charged with acquiring. In response, let me say a few things. There's no way of providing a satisfying reply without offering a quite different presentation for you today, and I've already taxed your patience enough. However, I hope I've sown the seeds necessary to provide a reply in the future. And the careful listener might already be able to guess how these seeds are meant to grow. I've discussed proportionality throughout this presentation in terms of its effects on individual humans. I've been concerned with the extent to which war makes lives worse and shorter than they would have otherwise been. I've shied away from understanding harms done to either the natural or the political environment in terms of anything other than instrumental disvalue. I'll now admit that my doing so was not entirely innocent. Thinking about proportionality in terms of its effects on human lives does not completely remove concerns about incommensurability or incomparability. It does lessen the extent to which they're likely to stop us in our tracks. In order to justify exclusion of consideration of EMM harms from the antebellum proportionality condition, substantive reasons are, I think, required. The ones that are most likely to appeal are these. The costs associated with EMM harm are often borne by those far away from the war through means other than direct violence, in many cases, years, decades, or even centuries in the future. And the harms associated with global climate change are really a case in point. Here, I think the most persuasive approach is also likely to be the most tedious approach. And that approach is to show that when it comes to antebellum proportionality in general, the spatial, causal, and temporal distance between the act of war and the harm that results from it are irrelevant, or at least not so relevant that they make a significant difference regarding how EMM harms are considered. I've attempted to do this in a much longer version of the paper, though I'll admit that the attempt gets into deep waters quickly, not least because of some issues raised by the non-identity problem and concerns about a collapse into long-termism. Again, happy to discuss this during the Q&A, but I won't say anything more about this here. Before wrapping up, and this is the last substantive slide, I want to raise one more issue that might be of interest to the audience. I've somewhat provocatively called this environmental blackmail. Let me explain. I've argued, or at least claimed, that whether it's justified for a state to go to war is contingent on whether the benefit of achieving its justified end, self and other defense, exceed, among other things, environmentally mediated harm done by the war. I've also claimed, but not really argued, that these costs are likely to be high and that it's probably the case that war is much harder to justify once these costs are taken into consideration. Now consider one surprising implication if all of this is correct. Imagine that, and I apologize for the names, imagine that aggressor begins a war unjustly with defender and occupies some of defender's territory. Defender has a just cause for responding by going to war with aggressor, let's say. Suppose also that defender meets the other conditions of jus ad bellum, such as likelihood of success and last resort. But suppose finally that going to war with aggressor would lead to a great deal of EMM harm because of the especially fragile nature of the ecosystems involved. As a result, the war would fail to meet the proportionality condition. It follows, doesn't it, that defender must remain passive, at least with respect to military action, in the face of aggressor's injustice. Moreover, it's conceivable that aggressor will continue to carve up defender's territory in this way, and that it will continue to be the case that it's unjust for defender to defend itself. Let me emphasize 2 points in response. The first is that I'm not claiming that this situation might not be a morally accurate accounting of the matter. It might be. but it certainly gives one pause and makes me want to retrace the steps that led us here. Very careful. The second point is that I do realize that there are analogous situations that don't involve EMM harm. An aggressor might also attack defender in ways that make it very difficult, if not impossible, for it to defend itself without risking the lives of many non-combatants, essentially using them as what used to be called human shields. Doing so can make response to aggression disproportionate. The fact that this problem can arise in cases where we're not considering EMM harm suggests that it's a general issue for just war theory, and I think that's probably correct, even though considering EMM harm clearly exacerbates the problem. I've suggested elsewhere that one way around problems of this sort is to treat at least some of the principles of jus ad bellum as Rossian prima facie duties rather than necessary conditions, but this isn't the place where I'll rehash those arguments. I just want to thank you for listening to me work my way through these ideas this morning. I'm grateful too for the opportunity, and I'll just take a second also to thank the organizers of the conference for their hard work, which mostly goes unseen, but certainly not unappreciated. So my gratitude to Rachel and Court for all they've done, and to Michael for serving as chair, and to everyone else who's been involved. And with that said, I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for that talk. It was very, very interesting. We've got 2 questions to start off in the chat, as well as anyone else who is interested can start queuing up either in the raise hand feature or in the chat. It's Dr. Khan's call as to how long he wants to answer questions. We have significantly longer than we normally would, but also in deference to his own personal energy and interest and the discussion length, it'll be up to his call, but just to say we may have more time than usual. So I guess we have one call from question from, I think the first one was from Paul Wilson, or no, Keith Abney. He makes this comment, if you don't see it, the asymmetry problem seems relevant here. What if a war caused environmental benefit? A medium level nuclear exchange, say between India and Pakistan, would considerably mitigate territorial harm or something. I think is, unless I'm missing something, but if you want to respond to that.
Thanks, thanks, Keith. That's a nice point. There's
a global warming.
Yeah. I think there's actually an episode of Futurama where this idea is pointed out, right? Nuclear winter may cancel out. That's it, right? Fry is looking back on the 20th century and trying to figure out what happened to global climate change, and somebody points out that the nuclear winter canceled it. It's an interesting case. It is. I guess I have to think a little bit more about it. I suspect that on balance, right, the kind of damage done by a nuclear exchange large enough to cause some kind of mitigation of global climate change would still be negative. For example, even in the short term, reduced growing seasons would probably cause tens or so, if not more, of millions of people to starve to death. But yeah, it's a very grim calculation for sure. I'll have to think more about this. There may be other situations in which there's some kind of environmental benefit, and I suppose it wouldn't be a complete shock, since in fact our effect on the environment is already so considerable. Any kind of large scale change in which sort of humans interact with one another is going to have some kind of effect on global climate change going forward. If we knock ourselves back to the Stone Age, right, that too will probably mitigate global climate change, although at an awfully steep cost. Ashley, I see you've got a hand up. It's great to see you, by the way. Did you want to follow up on this, or were you queuing up?
Oh, no, I was queuing up, but good to see you.
Okay. Maybe I should go through the questions in the chat first, since they were up here first. Let's see. Paul asks, how would EMM harm be quantified? Is EMM harm a territorial harm? So yeah, I mean, I kind of showed my hand a little later in the paper, and I think probably the best way to approach this would be in terms of sort of harm on human beings, right? You might think of that in terms, right? If you want to try to quantify it in terms of, say, loss of quality adjusted life years, something along those lines. To be sure, those calculations are going to be quite crude and open to a lot of uncertainty. Nevertheless, I think in many cases, if not most cases, they're going to be fairly large, even if we're guessing about a couple orders of magnitude. So it's possible to make a fair calculation about these kinds of things. And I would encourage us to sort of risk being wrongish, basically, in order to get these costs on the table, even if we estimate them as being too large or too small. Nevertheless, we're just not considering them at all right now, as far as I can tell. So it's better to get them on the table, even if they're very messy business. Let's see. And Andrew's got a question about alleviating environmental harms. Yeah, so this is along the same line. This is probably something I need to think more about. Let's see, a way about water in desert regions. We're stopping deforestation. Yeah, this is a possibility. And one thing to look at, I suppose, is just our history up to this point. We've fought no shortage of wars over the last 100 years or so, and while there may have been short-term decreases in certain kinds of productions of pollutants and the like, I think the trend has not been to over the long term to reduce these things. There are conceptual possibilities for sure, and again, there are possibilities under really catastrophic circumstances, but. Yeah, that's something I do want to have a better answer to. Andrew, does that help? And I should have asked Paul as well. Does that help sufficiently with the kind of question you had in mind, or did you want to follow up on that?
I think Andy had to leave, but Paul is here.
Yeah, I mean, your talk was really interesting, and I totally agree that these considerations need to be taken into account. What I was trying to get at too is in the issue of just fighting. It seems to me that environmental destruction could be used in a way that could be considered unjust, and I'm not sure. Did I miss something in what you said that would allow this? I mean, as well. I mean, it seems like the proportionality issue ties into just fighting as well as you said, Bellum. Right. Good. Thanks. Yeah. So that's helpful. Oh, I see what happened. Got it. I was asking Paul and you're Paul. Yeah. But I'm happy to answer your question now. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This is an in bello issue. So here are the two reasons that I didn't address it here, neither of which are that interesting in a way. One is that I just was trying to delimit the topic. There's too much stuff there. So the other issue is the original design of the paper was to focus on the harm of global climate change. Right, and that's obviously something that is more salient at the ad bellum level than the in bello issue. And as the paper developed, I found myself sort of focusing more and more on more immediate kinds of harm. And a lot of the examples I use here, in a way, address in bello issues here. At least as well as the ad bellum stuff. So yeah, that's the kind of reason why when I decided to write the paper itself, I chose to do ad bellum rather than ad bello. But you're absolutely right. I completely agree with the qualification.
Okay, Ashley?
Yeah, so I'm just curious. One thing that that I guess it's a little bit on the sort of how we think about quantifying the harm, or sort of calculating what it might be from an ad valorem perspective, is thinking about um, how we sort of predict what that harm might be. And I was sort of so if you know, a little random of an example, but thinking about the different ways that that the United States, as compared to Europe, regulate the cosmetics industry, right? So, you know, the Europeans seem to want to say, well, we're going to presume that particular things are going to cause long-term harm, and if you want to use them, you know, you have to be sort of demonstrating that this thing is safe, and sort of thinking about, you know, the American forces destruction of the environment in Vietnam, right? And thinking about the idea that, you know, some of these harms we perhaps might say, well, we didn't necessarily anticipate that it would have this long-term harm, or we didn't have the empirical data, you know, at the time. And so kind of wondering if you get into discussing maybe some kind of presumption, right, that you know, use of either new types of weapons or something like that, we should just sort of presume is going to have long-term damage unless we can sort of demonstrate that it won't at the outset.
Thanks, Ashley. It's a great question. So here's one of the things that didn't make it into the presentation, but that's lurking in the now monstrously long paper. Proportionality, ad valorem proportionality is often subject to this kind of distinction, right? We talk about objective proportionality versus subjective proportionality. Objective proportionality is usually best judge ex post, right? After the fact, we can see just how harmful and, for that matter, how beneficial a particular rule was. There's some fact of the matter that is more or less accessible, at least to the extent that we can measure it in a cool hour. Subjective proportionality is something closer to an expected value calculation that one does ex ante. How damaging is this likely to be? Right? In the paper, right, I'm using historical examples. So yeah, it's all objective proportionality, looking back with the benefit of hindsight. I think that's the right way to go initially, right, in order to say this stuff matters, it may matter a lot. Once you've got a decent sort of background of that kind of thing to work with, I think you can start building forward to reasonable expectations about war being very harmful to the environment, right? You know, we've seen it a lot in the past, and here are the mechanisms by which it happens, and right, many of these mechanisms will be in place if a particular war is being fought now. So it's reasonable to have expectations of these kinds of harm. So yeah, the idea then is to make the case for objective proportionality, and then say, okay, given what we now know, it's reasonable to assume there'd be similar harms in similar kinds of wars. With that said, right, you know, the technology used in wars often changes pretty quickly once the war has started. So I think you know, there's a lot of argumentative work that needs to be done there. And for example, right, it's worth looking at wars and saying, do technological changes that occur during a war make environmental harms more or less likely? Right. Again, we can generalize on the basis of that. It's just induction, right? But it's better than nothing. There'll certainly be uncertainty involved in this kind of thing. But generally speaking, right, I think wars tend to be much worse for the environment than we expect them to be. And and this is not to say the wars aren't justified; they may well be. But we've got to look the harm in the eyes. And right now, I think we've got one eye closed. Great. Thanks for the question. Jen Kling has her hand up.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
No, thank you for that awesome discussion. And I think my question actually just follows up of what you were just saying in response to Ashley, which is, I love it when that happens. Because what I'm now thinking through, right, is whether it would maybe be more helpful to fold this as well into discussions of jus post bellum, right? And start thinking about right? Because given that these are going to be long-term harms, right, that as you so nicely laid out are going to occur over generations, right, and over territorial space, right, where territory, we all know, right, borders and territories can shift. I'm wondering if it's helpful then to say like, look, this is going to be a just postbellum concern. So not only if you use these weapons, that do you have to have an in bello benefit, but also you've got to then pay attention to the postbellum issues that are going to come up.
Yeah,
I hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree about that. I think environmentally mediated military arms have post-bellum implications. I think that's absolutely right. I don't have a lot of thoughts other than I agree, because I haven't sort of worked downstream that far. But that's absolutely an issue. It also may make sense to think of it. I made a sort of silly remark about use pre-bellum, right, in all this, but it makes sense to think of international law, right, and especially international humanitarian law in terms of building in sort of constraints on especially dangerous environmental weapons and the like. That is to say, weapons that are especially dangerous for the environment and for humans through the environment. So yeah, there's a whole kind of cycle of pre-war, during war, and after war that ought to be taking into consideration all of these things, and to a large extent, that's missing. Although there is, interestingly, a little bit more work done in international law than in just war theory on the philosophical side about this stuff. So yeah, completely agree.
So I'm looking at the chat. I don't see anything else in the chat. Does anyone have anything else that they would like to ask Dr. Khan, whether in the chat or orally?
Yeah, I mean, we, Leonard, you've been going for a while.
Yep.
It's turning into a dissertation defense.
Well, I will tell you, my dissertation defense got a lot murky.
Yeah.
I have the scars to prove it.
Sounds to me like you've got a book in the making to deal with all aspects of the just war theory according to the environmental implications. So interesting stuff.
It does seem to sprawl that way. Yeah, every time I turn around, I think, oh, well, that's at least a chapter. This might keep me busy. Well, I'm glad people find it interesting. This is actually the first time I've had a chance to give this an airing. So
I have a crazy question for you, Leonard. I was just thinking of biological warfare, right? And how when the world shut down, how you got all these reports about how the environment was getting better. Of course, it was at a great cost of many lives. But would that be an ethical war? Does that make a justification for biological warfare, or?
So it's an interesting thought. I suppose what history has shown us with respect to wars is that they're usually fought along lots of lines simultaneously. It's not the case that just biological agents are used. Many different approaches are used at the same time. Given that they're all used side by side, and probably have to be in order for countries to meet the goals that they have in war, justified or not, it's likely that we wouldn't see, for example, the fall off in the use of fossil fuels that we did see as the result, or apparently so, as a result of the COVID outbreak. What seemed to be the case, and lots of folks out here will probably have a much better understanding of this than I, but it seemed to be the case is that there was a kind of slowdown in the global economy initially. That meant things were getting shipped around less, and that meant less fossil fuels being used.
But if that were all right, if biological agents were used, it might to some extent have an effect on depressing sort of normal world economic activity, but other kinds of use of fossil fuels would probably dominate as countries start moving their troops all over the place. It also might be that if the biological agents are being used in local areas, people don't just hunker down; they get the hell out of there. Which is probably good advice. So yeah, but that's I mean the point you make, Court, though, is probably goes in the bucket that we started with, which is what about possible benefits? And yeah, being a kind of gloom and doom person myself, I just haven't thought enough about that, but need to do so.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Leonard. It just, as you were talking, it reminded me how in World War I, it was some of the chemical means were seen as more humane, right? And then that's quickly changed. So,
yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, one that takes us to another place. But yeah, I won't start that conversation. But
right.
Yeah, it is very strange, right? It is very strange. Attitudes shifting over time about what counts as humane or not humane in war, if anything, is.
All right, so just in terms of programming, we've got a little extended break. If you want to go over and check out the end of the Justice and Punishment room, I'm going to close this down to take care of the